Okay, well, welcome everybody to the American Adaptation Society of Adaptation Professionals. This is our Climate Migration and Managed Retreat group. I'm Christian Kamrath, help co-lead this group with a few other folks who are also on this call, Isaac, Barrett, and Blake, among a few others. But really happy to have folks here, and I'm excited to bring to you guys, and with credit going to Blake Gentry of our leadership, bringing together this session today. And we're just really excited to have you guys here to learn more about experiences in Guatemala and how this is affecting communities there. So we hopefully get a few guest speakers connected as well. But yeah, with that, I'll pass it over to Blake to kick us off, and introduce yourself, Blake, and others. That'd be great.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming, taking the time today to be with the Climate Migration and Managed Retreat group from the American Society of Professional Adaptation Professionals. And to the others who have presented before, including Barrett, who work in Indigenous communities. It's always helpful to know other folks who are working in this area in specific sectors. So my particular sector is working with Indigenous peoples and climate change. And so I want to welcome you to this presentation called Hidden in Plain Sight, Indigenous Peoples Migration from the Central American Dry Corridor, or in Spanish, Oculto la vista, Migración de Pueblos Indígenas del Corredor Seco, Centroamericano. We are hoping today to get connected as well with Nelson Morales Hernandez, who lives in Western Guatemala. He's from a Mam community in Tacaná, which is next to the Mexican border. I'll show you a slide of that. And Juan Popchok, who is also a farmer, but in another very different region of Guatemala, in northern Guatemala, in Petén, Guatemala. And with him will be Kenneth Erika, who works with the organization called the Seco, which is a health promotion, health training program. So we'll get moving quickly here. And I just want you to know, you're going to see this picture on the left a couple of times throughout the presentations. Just kind of look at it and see if you can figure out what's going on in that photo. Here it is again. The sources used today, the primary sources are these listed here. If you have questions later, we would like to get back to them, then you have them here and you can look them up. I want to give a thanks to Deanna Liverman, who's retiring as of 2 days ago, a top climate scientist in the United States, and she helped find a particular source for this presentation. What this presentation has to do with is the migration and the climate change impacts that are happening in a particular region in Central America called the Dry Corridor. For those who haven't heard of it before, Corredor Seco in Spanish, which pretty much extends from Nicaragua through El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala over towards the western edge of Guatemala and up north into the Petén, all the way up into the Yucatan Peninsula. And of note here is what the Catholic Relief Services are telling us is that climate change is happening increasingly in frequency and in intensity. Perhaps that sounds familiar to some of you. So the Dry Corridor has grown over time. You see it here on the left. Some years ago, and now it's estimated to be a larger area. So I think there's actually two things happening in this Dry Corridor area. And this source says about 45% of Guatemala is Dry Corridor. That might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but nevertheless, it is the phenomena of climate, but it's also the phenomena of, in some of these regions where this area is, there has been a lot of felling of forest, which makes that Dry Corridor expand and not shrink. So the long-term and short-term issue that is problematic for climate scientists in terms of looking at what are the patterns of climate change in Central America has to do with precipitation. As usual, it's easier to follow and have a little bit better records in terms of heat. But the precipitation records over Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador have been spotty in terms of a long to do downscaled models that are very accurate. This particular map right there is just showing the onset of the Dry Corridor season, how many days into the year that it starts in all of these different places. And you can see the great variation there, even though it's the same region. You can see the lower and the higher levels, or the shorter and the longer days that it takes to get the onset going. So we'll go into this a little bit more, but that's really the issue for downscaled models, is that the paleoclimate reconstruction nor the modern records don't show significant or consistent trends. And so if you don't have a consistent trend, it's hard to know what to expect. And if you don't know what to expect in terms of climate, then it's very difficult to be able to work in adaptation. So here on the right, we have an explanation as to the cause of why there's such a variation or variability in the climate that confronts Central America, especially in the summertime, called midsummer drought, which is a seasonal drought. And it has to do with in the west coast of this landmass by southern Mexico, western Guatemala. In the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, there is convection, and that is generated by solar radiation. There's a dip in solar radiation and the convection drops. And so there's less precipitation to come inland. And this is when you have from June to July and August, this change in the precipitation. And then by September, it picks back up again. And that's what this is depicting here, this diagram on the right. The midsummer drought can be seen here fairly easily. If your Zoom screen is blocking it as mine is, you can move it, but you will see the scale to the right, and the palest yellow area is where we have the dry corridor with the least amount of rain. And it may surprise us that even with that, the annual average in this whole region is around 59 inches. By comparison, US rainfall is around 30. Annual rainfall, and where I live in the Sonoran Desert on both sides of the border, it's anywhere from 3 to 20. Where I live in Tucson, it's normally around 10 to 12. The other problem is the magnitude of precipitation. It's measured by the average between the lowest and the greatest rainfall days, but this shows you whether or not you're getting a concentrated rain. And you can see even in this map, the big white splotches sort of in the north and eastern areas, that's due to a lack of climate record. And so that's a little bit difficult then on a national level or even a regional level to do planning for adaptation, given you have a hard time in terms of predicting. So it comes down to working in what amount to particular environments, and then the ecosystems and the eco niches in those particular regions to understand what's really going on. And that was our hope for our speakers today, to be able to illuminate a bit on that. You can see this is a downscaled measurement here, 37 years, but it's still not a very good record. And this was put out in 2019, it's fairly recent. So this is the problem that the models have. We're all familiar, or most of us are familiar with climate models using all types of variables to predict the future and where it's going to be. But it looks like this internal variability is going to continue until the end of the century. So the normal approach, perhaps at the more gross level of trying to look at climate trends and then just planning for adaptation makes this much harder. And so I would say that we need other methods that aren't being employed very well or not extensively enough in the Central American region in order to actively engage in successful adaptation. The first speaker, if we can get them on the line, will be Nelson Morales. He's over here in Tacaná in this area, which is part of the Western Highlands. It's very close to the Mexico-Guatemalan border. You can see this southern state of Chiapas, Mexico there. And you can also see along here Pan American Highway coming in. And so this is an area that's frequented, but it is the Western Highlands, which is forest. The other area is where Juan Popchok is, who's Cherokee. He's also a farmer. He's in Las Cruces. Las Cruces is in Petén. Excuse me. Petén is a northern region of Guatemala. It's about 28% of all of Guatemala. And it's this part that sticks up from the other part of the country. It's outlined in yellow and red on your screen. And Las Cruces is in the central zone towards the west in Guatemala. So I'm going to see if we can bring anybody on of our other speakers. if we see them, if Christian can help me. The person who is Galaxy A02S, if you would unmute your phone, si es usted de Galaxia A02S y identificarse, por favor. Hello.
Hello.
Sí, ¿quién es usted?
Mi nombre es Juan Popchok.
Juan.
Yo soy el alcalde auxiliar de la comunidad Caserío La Felicidad.
Bienvenidos, Juan. Entonces vamos a comenzar con usted. Bienvenido. No sé si...
Muchas gracias.
Ok. ¿Y Kenneth está con usted o no?
Estoy en mi casa, de mi familia.
Ok. Voy a tener que interpretar para usted. Entonces, si habla así, despacito, con pausas, voy a dar la introducción en inglés y regresamos a español. Bienvenido.
Muchas gracias.
So we have with us Juan Popchok, who is identifying his community, La Felicidad, Casería La Felicidad, which is a rural designation in Las Cruces, which is the municipality, and Petén, which is the department. There's departments, not states, in Guatemala, and then the country of Guatemala. So we'll begin with his presentation, and I will be interpreting live as we go forward. And this is Juan Popchok. Bien, adelante, Juan.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, nosotros como pueblo quechí tenemos muchos problemas que nos está afectando aquí en esta comunidad.
We as Kekchis have a lot of problems that are confronting us in our community. And Christian, if you can make this full screen for him, that would be great. Sigan adelante, Juan.
Primero es la inundación que nos afecta cada año y afecta todas las cultivas y también daños en las casas, y esos son problemas para nosotros.
We have problems with climate year-round. It affects our houses and it affects our crops as well. Sigue.
La segunda es la sequía. Cada vez que sembramos el maíz y el frijol y otros productos, que por la sequía, ¿verdad? No crece la milpa y hay muchas plagas. Total, no se puede controlar y esos son daños para nosotros.
Bien, antes usted dijo inundaciones, ya antes de la... Bien, okay. So he was speaking first about the impacts that were annual seasonal impacts, and that's flooding. And then the second impact that they have is drought, and the drought brings with it certain types of plagues that affects crops that they normally plant. Sigue adelante.
Y la tercera es sobre la migración. Como vuelvo a repetir, son por la migración, va, que se están saliendo mucho gente aquí en esta comunidad porque no hay cosechas que mejora la familia, ¿verdad? Entonces, por los daños que nos deja la inundación, la sequía. Entonces, por eso hay muchas familias que se están migrando, se están yendo a los Estados Unidos, dejando su familia. Pues es una situación que nos está afectando demasiado.
In my community, which is a Kekchi community, we see both flooding and the drought, which is really ruining our crops. And because of that, we see many families actually from my community who are migrating towards the United States, who are leaving their families here and migrating to the United States because of the crop failures. ¿Se puede decir específicamente cuáles cosechas hacen o cuáles siembras hacen?
La cosecha es la milpa, el frijol y el ajonjolí y la pepitoria. Y esos son los productos que más se cosecha aquí.
So it's corn, beans, sesame, and the last one I'm not familiar with that plant. Sigue. ¿Y cuáles son los efectos en cada siembra?
El efecto de la siembra, por ejemplo, de la milpa, es por el sol. Por ejemplo, ahorita empieza el verano, ¿verdad? La milpa ya no crece, ya no prospera, ¿verdad? Ya no da el maíz. Igual con el frijol, que la plaga, o sea, la plaga es que requema mucho las hojas y ya no da fruta, nada, y se termina. Y en el caso de la ajonjolí, ellos son una plaga que va afectando ya hace años, que no se puede curar. Son aquellos animalillos chinche que le dicen. Y en el caso de la pepitoria, igual, de la sequía, si tarda de crecer, el daño, el que después que viene encima de ese es la plaga de gusanos, que eso es que no se puede controlar también.
La última planta es algo que comen o es algo que venden.
Es que lo que comemos la planta es o sea, el maíz y el frijol.
Y el jonjolí se vende cuando se puede.
Es para vender, cuando se puede, exacto. Y también la pepitoria.
¿Y el jonjolí es por exportación?
No, es por menor, así por vender aquí en la comunidad.
Okay. So the different plants are affected differently. He says the corn is affected by the sun. Y el sol en cuanto a la milpa es que no hay suficiente sol o demasiado sol.
Demasiado sol.
So it's
aquí
too
no hay
strong.
mucho, digamos que llueve mucho, no, que es puro verano.
¿Se no llueve o sí llueve?
De vez en cuando llueve, solo con ese tiempo de mayo, junio, julio, ahí llueve, ahí ya no llueve.
Okay, so he's saying May, June, July, yeah, we don't get any more rains that are sufficient enough. And so the sun is just too strong for the corn crops, and that's what burns them out. In terms of the beans, there's a plague or a sickness that takes over. It ends up burning the leaves, and so the beans don't produce. And the sesame is infected by small insects which eats the plant. And I'm sorry, I don't know the fourth plant that he's mentioning, but it's also for sale. And I asked about the sesame, if it's for export, because there is export from Guatemala of sesame, but he said it's just used, sold and consumed more locally. Bien, Juan, en cuanto a la migración, ¿se sabe más o menos cuántas familias hay en total en la comunidad normalmente?
Aquí, sí, en la comunidad, como yo soy el alcalde auxiliar, lleva la cantidad de personas, son 1,200 familias.
Bien, ¿usted dijo que es alcalde?
Sí, yo soy el alcalde auxiliar de la comunidad.
De auxiliar. Y de esos 1,200, más o menos, ¿qué porcentaje diría que tiene un miembro de la familia migración?
La migración ya no te puedo decir el total porque ya se fueron bastante ya. Es por el desempleo que nos encontramos y por buscar un mejor futuro para la familia, y por eso decidieron de marcharse.
¿Se piensa que alcanza al menos 120 personas que han migrado?
Yo digo que sí.
Ok, bueno, 120 sería, representa, si son de diferentes familias, 10%, ¿no?
Sí, sí.
Juan said that he is the vice mayor of his town, and he said there's 1,200 families. I was saying, can you give a guesstimate of how many have left, or members of families who have left? He said he wasn't sure, and I asked if he thinks it's at least 120, and he said yes, that would be, if they're all from different families, 10% of the population of that particular town. ¿Hay algo más, Juan, que le gustaría compartir con nosotros sobre los efectos? Si hay efectos, por ejemplo, de salud. Pensé que Kenneth iba a comentar en cuanto a esto y no está, pero si usted se ha visto o se puede dar una descripción de los impactos en cuanto a la salud comunitaria.
Muy bien. Sobre la salud comunitaria nos está dando, por ejemplo, las enfermedades, porque nosotros nos bañamos en el río, ¿verdad? Y a la vez, como en el tiempo ahorita empezó la lluvia, con esa lluvia que cae, que juntamos, eso tomamos. Y hay veces que cuando no llueve, el agua que está en el río, aquí cerca, eso es ahí donde nos bañamos y hay veces eso lo tomamos y es el río que lleva mucha cantidad de desechos, animales muertos, etcétera. Entonces, a todos nos está afectando. Nosotros, los adultos, nos están saliendo enfermedades de mancha y etcétera, y dolor de estómago, todo. Y a los niños, la enfermedad, calentura, paludismo, diarrea, arrojaderas, eso son lo que está causando en el río, porque nosotros no contamos con agua potable y yo digo que por eso. Nosotros somos un grupo de gente quechí, 100% de Alta Verapaz.
Bien. ¿Migraron de Alta Verapaz?
Sí, de Cobán.
¿Desde cuándo?
De 2021, 2001, perdón, 2001.
Bien, regresamos a esto, pero so he said that what happens is they're affected indirectly, actually, because the rivers that normally, if they had more rain, flow frequently or consistently, and the river right next to their community is used for them to bathe in. They normally bathe in the river. They also take the water and they drink that. But when there is not enough precipitation, which creates the rainfall for the rivers to flow more fluidly, then they are affected by what's happening in low-level rivers, and that is waste from farms, cow manure, other byproducts of agricultural processes, probably fertilizer coming off. But this is a problem for them. They do not have potable water. They are a Quechua community, and this has caused for them things like contaminations for health, stomach aches, skin rashes, temperatures for children, and diarrhea in the children. And so this is having a direct effect. So it's an indirect effect in terms of the climate impacts, but it's a direct effect for them in terms of health. So those are some of the things that happened. He also said that there's a Quechua community that came from a different region. The region below Petén is called Alta Verapaz, and he said that they moved from Alta Verapaz, his community, in 2001. Christian, how are we doing on time?
We're doing okay, Blake. I don't know if you think Nelson will still be able to join. If not, then we could spend a little more time.
I think we'll continue then unless he shows up. Bien, una pregunta, Juan, es que ¿por qué la comunidad salió del Alta Verapaz y mudaron al Petén en el 2001? No se escucha.
¿Sí?
Así.
Vale. Nosotros, ¿me escucha?
Sí.
Bueno, nosotros nos migramos porque por la guerra que hubo, que pasó en el año 70 o en el año 80, bueno, yo no sé muy bien, pero nuestros padres fueron que sufrieron, fueron masacrados. Entonces vino una organización de familias, se juntaron e invadimos una finca propiedad de la municipalidad de Cobán, y ahí, por la lucha que hicimos, logramos logramos comprar una finca donde estamos, porque donde estuvimos nos amenazaron que nos iban a, no sé, a sacar, que nos iban a matar. Entonces, para no pelear tanto con la municipalidad de Cobán, hicimos un préstamo a través de Fondo de Tierra, un crédito que nos otorgaron, y por eso nos venimos acá de Petén, no que no somos puro 100% Petén, que somos 100% de Cobán, Alta Verapaz.
Bien. So the story of his community's migration is particular to Guatemala, but not just Guatemala. In the 1980s, there was a civil war raging, and members of the community had been affected by the war. His father's generation were witnesses to massacres, and they had to leave where they were, and they went to a farm, and they came to invade the farm or to stay on that farm and had political struggles around that with the municipality, the county government that was there. And over time, they continued to receive threats. So through the federal government, they applied for and got a loan to buy a place in the place where they are now, which is in Petén, north of Alta Verapaz. I would point out that there's a difference in the type of environment in Alta Verapaz. It's low-level mountains, hills, forested, almost semi-tropical, pretty humid, but in the place where they are now, Las Cruces is semi-tropical and it's lowlands and it's apt to flood. Bien, estaba diciendo yo, Nelson, de que la diferencia entre la tierra y el medio ambiente que hay en Alta Verapaz, hay diferencia entre ese lugar y lo que hay en Petén, ¿no? Y más que todo en Las Cruces, de lo que yo he visto.
Bueno, no tiene la diferencia, no que la tierra es igual, como digo, la diferencia acá es que no nos da, no nos da la cosecha, lo que queremos, y por la distancia también que estamos del municipio, que no tenemos apoyo de la comunidad, o sea, de la municipalidad, ¿verdad? Que más que exigimos, lo más que queremos es el agua potable, ¿verdad? Que nosotros no contamos con agua potable, no, que tenemos que correr de 1 kilómetro para buscar agua donde hay un nacimiento de agua. Entonces, por eso la gente ya están cansada, ¿verdad?
Bien. He's saying that he doesn't see so much difference in terms of the quality of the land that they're using to grow crops, but one of the issues where they are now, not the other place previously where they live, but in Las Cruces is they don't have potable water, and they were hoping from the municipal government that they would have potable water, or that the municipal government would assist them in development. They live 1 kilometer away from where there is a spring of water, and so the community has to walk that kilometer in order to get water and bring it back to their community for their own consumption. So that's a basic issue. I'm now adding my own comment, but a basic issue in terms of the long-term need for basic development in Guatemala, tied in with the reality of these impacts on their food crops. ¿Hay algo más que le gusta? Una pregunta más específica. ¿Se sabe o hay un lugar específico en los Estados Unidos, Nelson, donde los que están migrando al fin llegan? ¿Hay una comunidad en particular, a un estado donde más llegan cuando están migrando a los Estados Unidos?
Pues hay un lugar donde se llama en Los Ángeles o en Texas, Houston. Hay más que todo, ahí quedan la gente.
Bien. Bueno, ha sido agradecemos mucho su participación. Si se quiere quedar, seguimos en la presentación. Hay otros dispositivos que voy a mostrar, explicar la migración, y se va a ver algunos mapas si se puede quedar, Nelson.
Muy bien, muchas gracias.
Okay, so I'm thanking Nelson for his presentation. And invited him to stay if he can. There'll be some slides now. We'll go more into the part about migration itself, but I thank Nelson, and towards the end, if he's still with us, I think he can be, we could have questions and answers, and I can interpret for that. So I'm going to move on from there. Si quiere pagar su micrófono, Nelson, ya vamos en adelante, pero si queda en la línea, por favor.
Va, está bien. Gracias.
So I'm going to skip through a couple of slides now, but this is just showing us quickly what Nelson was saying happened in his particular community. Seeds going into the ground and then huge crop losses. And here we have an example of coffee plants, which the other presenter probably would have spoken about. I'm sorry, I was calling him Nelson, and he's Juan Popchok. My apologies. So Nelson's actually the person from Western Guatemala, and in that region, they grow coffee, not just coffee, but this is a normal coffee plant, a photo from another place, but this is the type of coffee plant that you would see that's healthy. And then the plague, that's the infections that are happening, these plants, turns these plants like that, and it kills the coffee plants, which take a couple, 3 to 4 years, I think, to bring back before they can actually produce coffee again, if you can get rid of the disease. So we're going to go now more into issues directly about migration. Maybe perhaps the second part of this, though you can see that they're directly related. Where I work is a shelter. It's called the Alitas Shelter or Casa Alitas in Tucson, Arizona. And there was a collaboration between the International Mayan League in 2019. And they wanted to do research on people arriving and talk to them about the reasons for migration. And these are the results. It was a small sample of 39 people, but when asked just outright why they left, we had 74% of folks saying they left because they had a loss of work or a need for work, not dissimilar to what you might have heard from Juan Popchok, just asking him that outright. However, when we probed a bit more and we asked them, well, what were the reasons why there wasn't work, or what work did you have, or what happened in your situation? We were able to ferret out that there's an underlying base of reasons. 69% said it was due to a lack of work. And given that a decent percentage of these respondents were Indigenous, that matches the 75% poverty rate for Indigenous in Guatemala. Limitation on access to land for 13%, reduction perhaps or loss of remittances or indebtedness, 10% remittances being sent back by family members from another country who are already working and sending money back. And then climate change impacts and also violence registered at 8%. And then those workers who are being displaced by plantation agriculture or pollution from such agriculture, around 5%. However, when we asked them to prioritize the reasons for migration, again, we got the loss of work at the same percentage, but you will see that violence and threats of violence and human rights violations were around 40%. And climate change registered at 23%, a little less than a quarter, and debt around 10%. So this data is pretty consistent with larger studies that have been done. The World Food Program has been continuing to track reasons why people leave and so on. And one thing I actually ran across last night was they said that 30% of Guatemalans who migrate are leaving the agricultural sector. So I'll move on. Here you have, again, the same map you saw originally on the right, this dry corridor, the onset of the dry season in the midsummer drought period. And then here we have data from Casa Alitas when we were tracking all of the people who came through our shelter, which 99% are families. And those families would register with us their primary language. And so with that, we were tracking how many of the folks who came through were primary language speakers, and it was 1 in 5 or 20% over a time period, actually from 2014 to 19, but the data you're going to see now is basically 2017 to 2019. This has been since confirmed by Americans for Immigrant Justice out of Miami, or Dade County, who work with unaccompanied minors who come from all the border areas, since our data is just basically from the Arizona border. But they also found of the unaccompanied minors that came from all the border areas and fed into Florida, that they found that 20% of those unaccompanied minors also spoke an Indigenous language as a primary language. So we know that this data now has a good proxy. The routes that are taken, you heard from Juan Popchok, and here you can see the lowlands. There's Tikal, the famous Tikal ruins. This is in Petén, the same region he lives in. But the Altiplano, which is Western Guatemala, that route is the one that usually leads to people coming up into Arizona or into California. And more of the folks that he was talking about who migrate go on the Atlantic route. And that route ends up in Texas. And we'll look at that kind of data in just a minute. The languages, the top 13 that we were able to track, you see the list here. They are Mayan languages, except for number 12. Number 12 is Mixtec, which you can see over here has a lot of different variants, which is the linguistic term of preference. In other words, dialects, but those dialects are so distinct in Mixtec that they're almost separate languages. And the other languages, all of the others, 1 through 13, are Mayan languages, and you see the lines of attribution where they are. There's a few that are in an area this is the Western Highlands area. There's a few that aren't, like Pocomchi, which is over here, and then Kekchi, which is the language of Juan Popchok. We saw a trend of change. This data, the blue, is all of the languages from 2014 to 19, all of these highlands except for Kekchi, which if I can get this, I don't know if you have this in your way or not, but it's the quadrant that's right here. But we started to see in the latter part of the period in which we measured languages, 2017 to 19, that there were new languages that were coming from other regions. That would be Achi, Pocomam, Chorti, and Itza. Those are either from the east or the north of Guatemala and not from western Guatemala. And that means that there was a change in some migration routes for those who were coming from those regions of Guatemala. Again, you see this map. We will move on now quickly, though, to where they're arriving in the United States. And you're going to see a series of maps pretty quickly for each individual language and the places they arrive, and then a statistical analysis of the clusters of these towards the end. So we're going to go fast. Here is Mam speakers. I'm going to back up. 534 of the 1,333 families were speakers of Mam. Here we have Quiche, 184. Kekchi, the language of Juan Popchok, 159. Kankobal, 145. Chuk, 58. Ixil, 45. Atateca, 41. Hakateca Popti, 35. Achi, 33. Cachiquel, 26, Quechua, which are from Ecuador, or Quechua from Peru, 14, and Mixteco, as we mentioned before, and their usual destination is Southern Central California. Now we did and then the arrival places in terms of the weight or the concentrations, you can kind of see here. The darker the number, the more families. Florida is actually the dominant one, and then after that is California. And you can see are very few states where we didn't register. And of course, we're not the only shelter. We're the third largest shelter on the US-Mexico border. And the largest one is in Texas, which would have probably a different pattern. And the second largest one is in San Diego. So we did a statistical analysis of comparing where these language speakers arrived compared to random, and that statistical test has a measure of 1 to 10. Anything 2 or higher is significant for that test. And what you are seeing are these places where these arrivals registered at 2 or higher in terms of that statistical test, taking the top 20 languages. I'm not going to go through each of the languages or where they are, but this is called the Arizona or Phoenix, California corridor, since they come through Arizona mostly. And you can see where they're being concentrated in southern Arizona or Southern California around LA and towards the north in San Francisco Bay Area. Second place of concentration, which matches up exactly with what Juan Popchok was talking about, is Texas. The large blotch there is Houston, and the second one is Dallas. And I would just say that Kekchis have had and Quiches, actually the Quiches have had a long history of migrating to Houston over a long period of time. The next one is the concentrations in Florida, which you can see are fairly highly concentrated. And the importance of Florida isn't just that it's a destination for more than any other place in the United States, doubling that of any other state, the next one of which is California. It's also a feeder state into other areas of the United States, and we're going to be seeing that shortly. Here we see what is, for myself, the most interesting area. We see this very scattered pattern. This is almost all agricultural work, but it's the southeast area, including Appalachia, a little bit of the Atlantic seaboard. And this particular area, you can see, is the most concentrated. And as a member of the Cherokee Nation, I recognize this was the former territory of the Cherokee Nation, and our displacement in around the 1839 to 1842 preceded this, this arrival of other indigenous peoples into exactly the same region. The last one is the Northeast Megalopolis corridor. It starts in the tri-state area, DC, Virginia, Maryland, and then it moves up the highway system through the US to Philly, New York, and Boston. And there are particular patterns of languages associating their moves with other languages. And that we've done because there isn't time to go into it, but there is some social linguistic significance to the association of some languages to others, having to do with their relationships in the Mayan language tree. So I'm going to switch now to I'm about to end here. Oops. There we go. I couldn't get my thing to turn off. And let's get rid of this version. And I will be looking at one other thing here. Okay, well, sorry for the rigmarole. We'll get to where we need to go. So one of the things that happens is that as we saw the climate record for Central America, especially the dry corridor region, and the problem with the lack of data, we do know what many of the impacts are, and partly the reason we know that in the United States, not because we're paying attention to the dry corridor itself, but because people are migrating here. So climate change migration is international, it's regional in the Mesoamerican region. We're acutely aware of that, excuse me, on the southern border of the United States. But I would also say that climate scientists now, environmentalists, adaptation specialists, and those in development work in that region also have the possibility of looking for other indicators, and perhaps it's time for us to think about what those indicators might be. Let's see here. Sorry, my mouse is not cooperating with what I want to do. So we oftentimes see things that we think we're familiar with. This particular photo threw me for a while. Some of you may be able to depict what's going on here. After a while, I understood that we have a person here who has on his back carrying potted plants, which are these plants. And this is actually a growing area on the side of a forest. Here's the forest. And these are rows of plants being grown here. But we also have other relationships in which we can understand what's going on if we pay attention to the deeper, perhaps, and more local indicators. So I wanted to be able to demonstrate that visually by the fact that there's things that we think we see that we don't always see. So I get the last slide to try to work with me here. It's a reminder that indicators are all around us if we have a way of looking for them, and we maintain the relationships that we have as Indigenous peoples with all of the other species that have helped us arrive to this time and to survive. So these are the two main messages of this presentation, that climate change in terms of climate records is not always our best friend in terms of understanding what's happening in the dry corridor of Central America, and migration is one result of that. Other reasons are their presence for the migration of people from Central America. And in terms of Indigenous communities, we do have resources and we do have knowledge that can be used if there is cooperation at the international level. So I want to leave it there and thank you all for coming, and we can open it for questions if there's still time for that. Christian, you can.
Yeah, no, this has been really great, Blake, and gracias, Juan Popchok. We really appreciate the insights directly from the places that we often hear about are feeling the impacts and having to make these tough decisions about whether to move or where to move or to take that risk. leave your home, or even if it's the second time or third time you've had to move. So a huge thanks. And yeah, I know I have a question or two, but I want to open it up to other folks. Questions for Blake on the material that he presented, or if you want to share in the chat or raise your hand or unmute and ask a question for Juan Popchok, and Blake can help translate as well. I think he's still on the line. So
Juan, si se oye, entonces que su micrófono está abierto, porque entramos en la sesión de preguntas. Si alguien tiene una pregunta, entonces se la va a dirigir a usted o a mí. Go ahead, anybody, if anybody wants to ask a question, it's open.
Maybe I'll ask a question. Juan todavía está aquí. Bueno, mi pregunta es que hay programas en Guatemala para ayudar a la gente como usted, para ayudar a los pueblos que necesitan mover. Si usted puede explicar los programas, o tal vez Blake puede. So the question is just what the government of Guatemala has, if they have any kind of programs for this.
For this, you mean for the impacts of climate or for migration?
For climate change and migration. Maybe I'm being a little bit broad.
Okay. ¿Se entiende la pregunta, Juan, de que si el gobierno tiene programas que se le puede ayudar a la comunidad en cuanto a los impactos, o también para la inmigración?
Pues aquí en Guatemala, para nosotros, campesinos, no hay programa, no hay ayuda, nada. Si el gobierno interesaría para los migrantes que no se vayan, el gobierno debería buscar cómo para que tenga empleo los que van a buscar en otro empleo en otro país. Aquí en Guatemala estamos totalmente abandonados. Digo eso porque aquí no hay programa. Es el único programa que nos está apoyando, nos apoyó un poco. Es un programa que se llama ASEXA. Eso no es gubernamental, no es gubernamental, no, como dijera, no es gubernamental, que no como se dice, pero no es del gobierno, son instituciones donantes que vienen en otros países.
Bien. He's saying that for us as farmers in our community, we don't see any programs from the government helping us. We don't have employment programs. There's no assistance to help those people who need employment, who are pushed to have to migrate. The only kind of assistance we get is from an organization called the SEXA, which is an NGO, a non-governmental organization that gets no money from the government. All of their funds are coming from foreign donors.
Blake, I have a quick question, and I also see a question in the chat too.
Okay.
We'll start with that one. Josh's question. Can you see that, Blake? Or I can read it.
Yeah, the question is, does the government of Guatemala acknowledge that climate change and climate impacts are a cause of migration? Está preguntando Juan que si el gobierno de Guatemala se crean o se dicen que la causa de la migración son los impactos o los cambios climáticos.
Sí, también por los impactos, por el cambio climático. Como digo, vuelvo a repetir que tal vez nosotros nos dedicamos a la cultiva, porque en ese tenemos la esperanza para sacar adelante a nuestra familia, ¿verdad? Pero lamentablemente no da lo que queremos, no da la cosecha, y por eso tiene que buscar dónde para sacar adelante a su familia más algún día, porque todos nosotros como que sí, todos somos pobres. Aquí nadie tiene dinero, nadie tiene buenas casas ni nada. Por eso todos los compañeros, hasta yo también pienso de emigrarme, pero gracias a Dios aquí estoy todavía. Me da pena por los compañeros que se fueron, dejaron sus esposas, dejaron sus hijos, porque no hay dinero, no hay apoyo del gobierno, nada, estamos totalmente abandonados.
Bien, Está preguntando algo un poco diferente. Voy a
Ajá.
interpretar lo que usted dijo, pero se pregunta que si el gobierno mismo, el gobierno de Guatemala, admite que hay cambios climáticos que está pasando y que estos impactos lo están impactando a las comunidades agrícolas.
Yo digo que sí, porque no hay no hay buenas cosechas por el cambio climático también, que ya no está lloviendo mucho, y si llueve lo acaba también, lo acaba también la lluvia otra vez, entonces total no hay solución.
Bien, pero la pregunta, Juan, no es que si está pasando, es que si el gobierno admite que está pasando, que si el gobierno está hablando de los impactos climáticos, si ellos atienden a las comunidades que están afectados por los cambios climáticos.
No atiendo, no hay apoyo, nada.
Okay, so I've asked the question in various ways, but he's emphatically saying that the government has no programs, they don't attend to us. It pains me that people that I work with have to leave and migrate in order to help their families and leave their families here. I myself am thinking about having to migrate. And I asked again if he knows if the government admits that there's climate change impacts and that those impacts are affecting him. So he's just repeating that those impacts are happening. He does live in a very rural area, and the closest contact that he has with the government there, I would say, is with a county government, which he previously said doesn't really supply them with anything, including potable water. Kristen, you had a question?
Yeah, my question was kind of about, he mentioned that some folks moved from the area south of Las Cruces in like 2001. And I'm just curious if, he's the vice mayor of his town and village, and if other vice mayors and other leaders in the region, if they're all facing similar issues, is there a sense of solidarity among other towns and leaders that he knows outside of his town, or is it feel like they're more on their own trying to make these decisions and advocate for themselves for support?
Se está preguntando como alcalde auxiliar y que si conocen otros alcaldes o alcaldes auxiliares en otras comunidades que tienen la misma experiencia que ustedes y que hay alguna discusión o diálogo entre ellos o algún esfuerzo para tratar de organizar para poder hacer algún cambio en cuanto a esta situación para dar voz a lo que ustedes, lo que pasa igualmente a otras comunidades igual que ustedes.
Pues aquí, como alcalde auxiliar es muy diferente que una organización. El alcalde auxiliar su cargo es cuidar o velar, nada más dar protección a la gente para que no haya violencia, nada. Para controlar de la migración no se puede organizar nada, totalmente nada, no hay apoyo para que nos podamos organizar como comunitarios.
Pero los alcaldes han hablado de esto, como en la región de Las Cruces o el área de Las Cruces han llamado para reuniones para discutir los impactos climáticos. Eso es lo que está preguntando él.
Sí, hablan de eso cuando hacen reuniones. Solo dicen que sí, están tratando la manera como para apoyar sobre el cambio climático, como para cuando afectan el cambio, ¿verdad? Pero no hay apoyo, no hay nada.
¿Y el apoyo de dónde viniera si quería dar apoyo? ¿Viene de la municipalidad, viene del departamento de Petén o viene del gobierno en Guate? ¿O de quién será si los alcaldes lo están pidiendo apoyo? ¿De dónde se esperan que viniera?
Los apoyos que dan ellos se viene a través de una institución que le dicen MAGA y una institución que le dicen el Corredor. Son esos nada más que apoyo cuando ya hay digamos daños.
Solo cuando hay daños como inundaciones a las comunidades directamente.
Exacto.
Okay.
Solo eso. Digamos, el apoyo de MAGA, el apoyo de MAGA es, según entiendo yo, que es para que le ayude a los campesinos, que le den digamos, de otras cosas alimenticias, ¿verdad? Pero eso no lo hace solo cuando hay daños, inundaciones, sequía, y es solo eso nada más.
Okay, so it's a complex response. He was saying, as an auxiliary mayor, his job actually is to make sure that there's physical protection against violence for the people in his own communities. That's his job. I asked again in terms of the mayors, the regular mayors, if they've come together and discussed any of this in a way in which this was brought to the fore, in which support was asked for, and if so, from what level of government. And his response was, yes, there are hard discussions, and this is discussed. The aid, though, that's received is usually disaster-related aid and food security aid, so that if a community has its crops wiped out because of a flood, there's disaster relief for that time period only, and they may help with a period for support for food security. But there isn't any ongoing adaptation plan or anything even remotely like that.
Thanks, gracias. There's another question from Lori in the chat.
Okay, Lori's asking what the situation for women and children are who stay in Guatemala when the fathers or the male family members leave. Is there a possibility for those family members to return to Guatemala? Se está preguntando Lori, que está también en esa reunión, ¿cuál es la situación de las mujeres y niños que quedan en Guatemala cuando se van los padres de familia? Si hay posibilidad de que se regresan esos padres o trabajadores a Guatemala.
Pues la verdad, las mujeres, o sea, la familia que se está migrando a los Estados Unidos, sus mujeres quedan en la casa de sus padres, ¿verdad? Con los hijos, y ahí quedan. Pues solo Dios sabe si ellos regresan o ya regresan o no, pues solo Dios lo sabe.
Wow.
Bien, gracias. Are there any other questions that folks have for Juan Popchok or myself?
Just a real quick follow-up question for you, Blake. You mentioned, I think it was the study of the International Mayan League, some of the results you were presenting on. You mentioned about 30% of people are leaving from the agriculture sector. Do you have a sense of what some of the other, major employment or other sectors that people are having to, leave from or find new work for outside of where they're coming from?
Yeah, that stat was actually from World Food Program report.
Okay.
I haven't read the full report. I did glean that. It was saying 37% of folks who migrated from Guatemala were farm workers, or that's what they identified. There's a transition in the economy of Guatemala. There's huge disruptions and outside influences in the Guatemalan economy. Namely, there are extensive networks of cartels, illegal criminal organizations that work with structures within the traditional military of Guatemala. This has been going on since the time of the Civil War, which intensified in the 1980s. And those are criminal syndicates. There is a president of Guatemala who was put in prison, and his vice president, for trying to get bribes out of the customs operation that comes through Guatemala City. So you have an overlay of regional problems in terms of organized crime at an extremely high level in Guatemala. I would say it's parallel to Honduras. The Honduran president is now being pursued by the United States government. His brother went to Miami and in court admitted that he was looking for someone to assassinate the opposition candidates who were running against his brother. His brother, who became the president of Honduras, was backed by a cartel. He was financially given money to run as a candidate. So we have a huge intervention of the cartel business in this, and I didn't do a presentation on this today, but it's impossible to talk about Guatemala without understanding that. A good source for that is called insightcrime.org. You can look and read about that. So that major influence is one of the things that's disrupting normal agriculture and other types of employment in Guatemala. So the service sector, Christian, people work in the service sector just like they do anywhere in the world. There was attempts, there have been attempts in the post-war period, which was really only got started in the 2000s for some tourism, ecotourism. We see some small examples of that, but the scale of investment needed is not there. And so there's a lack of national development in the areas mostly where indigenous people live in Guatemala, in the rural areas. So Big Ag came in with the trade agreements, the Central American Free Trade Agreement in 2005. The plantation agriculture has done a couple of things. In 2013, there was a report that the highest internal migration from any department in Guatemala to another department was actually to the Petén, which is quite surprising because Petén is rainforest. So the only way you make it agriculturally productive is to cut down the rainforest and bring in cattle. And the people who are doing that are ranchers, and a lot of those ranchers end up being on the payroll of cartel. So it's not a pretty picture, but the diversity of the economy in the local economy where other crops are grown and agriculture internally is possible, or even regional sales into the cities of agricultural trucked in, historically was blocked by the large families, 14 families that have a lot of control of the institutions in Guatemala, including the banking sector. So it's really impossible to talk about job sectors and employment without talking about the structure of the economy. But that is unfortunately what folks in Guatemala face. And the progress that is made, I think, typically is in line with what Juan talked about in terms of ASEXA being an NGO that's reliable. They've been around since the 1970s. I'm in an organization that collaborates with them, and they're very reliable. So that's a long answer to your short question.
Thanks, Blake. I think there's one more question in the chat from Josh.
Okay, let me get there. The question is, how much income remitted to Juan's community from people in the United States? Está preguntando Juan, el señor Josh, ¿cuántas remesas revuelvan de gente, de inmigrantes de los Estados Unidos a su comunidad? Es decir que, no sé si lo quiere Josh en un porcentaje, pero una familia, digamos, que está mandando remesas, se depende mucho. La familia en las remesas es como una porción pequeña, una mitad o 3/4 o todo el ingreso que tienen esas familias de las personas que han migrado.
Bueno, en este caso no te podría decir una cantidad, ¿verdad? Dependiendo de en qué trabajan. Depende de en qué trabajas. ¿En qué trabajo están? Si están en construcción, están en la yarda, no sé. Depende del pago también. Si una familia, como tengo mis hermanos, ellos están ganando como 120 o 130 dólares diario. Pero no se ve mucho la diferencia porque tienen los hijos, también tienen un hijo cada uno allá, lo que están cuidando. Entonces, lo máximo que manda por semanal, 1,200.
Lo máximo que mandan.
Ajá, 1,200.
1,200 quetzales.
Hasta que sí, quetzales.
Okay, I have to do some quick math here, but he's saying that, just to answer your question, it depends on what sector of work they're in. He said, if you're in construction or you're working in agricultural, et cetera, and the most that they can send back, usually in a week is 1,200 quetzales. If you divide that by 7 or 8, you're going to get a rough equivalent in dollars. Somebody does that, they could shout it out. That would give us some sense. I can tell you, in the same study I was looking at last night by the World Food Program, they said that the more, the sector that pays the most in the US, typically for those who are employed in the US, is there's construction, there's agriculture, and there's service sector. And actually, agriculture pays more, construction pays the second amount, and then the service sector pays the least amount. So that's, I can tell you that in terms categorically. Okay, so Josh did the math for us, and that's 100, 200 per family per week. He also said it depends on how many children there are, or if there's sons who went there to also work, if some are in the United States or some are back in the community. Está bien, Juan, él está diciendo que esto parece como 100 a 200 dólares por familia por semana.
Sí, así es.
Bien. Well, I think we're coming towards the end. Are there any other questions? También, bueno, Juan, estamos ya en la conclusión, pero pregunta si hay algún comentario que a usted le gusta hacer terminar la sesión de hoy.
Muchas gracias. Agradezco la invitación que me están dando. Agradezco a las personas esas. Le digo yo, thank yous a esos que están ahí, se me están mirando. Muchas gracias. Y hasta la próxima.
Gracias. Juan is expressing his thanks for this opportunity and says hello to everybody and thank you all for today. He looks forward to talking again.
Gracias, Juan.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Juan.
Muchas gracias.
So I think we're at the end here, and I want to thank everybody, Christian for his work, Barrett for previous presentations, and others who've been able to join us today for the Climate Migration and Managed Retreat Group, part of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. My name is Blake Gentry, and I work with Indigenous immigrants in the Southwest Border region. I want to thank you all, and I think that you can probably get my email through. I'm going to write it in the chat real quick here.
Perfect.
So in case somebody wants to write or you want any follow-up with sources or stuff like that.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much, Blake. We'll go ahead and wrap up. I'll just note, and we'll get this on folks' calendars as soon as we can. Our next meeting will be in July. So July 26th. We are doing them every other month, the last Tuesday of every other month. So keep a lookout for that. And yeah, we really appreciate your guys' time, and we'll be uploading this recording to our YouTube and be sharing that link as a follow-up. So thank you both, Blake and Juan Popchok, so much. Gracias.
Gracias.
Juan, si me puede enviar su teléfono por el correo electrónico, estaremos en comunicación.
Es por correo. No puedes escribir ahí, te doy el 36.
Bien.
36